What makes a peaceful evening turn into a nightmare? How fast can a garden filled with love become a place of fear? The sweet smell of roses filled the air as Mrs. Patricia Johnson, age 70, worked in her front garden. Her gentle hands moved carefully among the flowers she'd grown for many years. The evening sun made her gray hair glow like silver as she hummed her favorite song. "Looking good, Mrs. J," called Mr. Henderson from next door, picking up his mail. Patricia smiled and waved back. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. How could they not? She lived in this house for 40 years, raising her son Marcus, who now held one of the highest jobs in the city. But who would have guessed this quiet evening would change everything? The loud screech of car brakes broke the peace. A police car pulled up fast, lights flashing. Two officers jumped out, their hands near their guns. "Get away from the property!" the tall officer shouted, his name tag reading Matthews. Patricia's heart jumped, but she stood straight. "Officer, this is my home. We got a call about someone suspicious," the younger officer, Reed, said. "Show us some ID." "My ID is in my house," Patricia said calmly, even as fear made her hands shake. Matthews stepped right into her flower bed, crushing her beautiful roses. "We need to check everything." "Please, my flowers," Patricia begged, watching them destroy her garden. While Matthews walked around her house, Reed blocked her way to the door. Patricia slowly reached for her phone hidden in her garden apron. All her years as a black woman in America told her to stay calm, but also to be smart. She pressed the button for her son's number. "Don't move!" Matthews yelled, coming back. "Keep those hands up!" Patricia raised her hands, leaving the phone on in her pocket. Would her son hear what was happening? Would he understand she needed help? Miles away at police headquarters, Commissioner Marcus Johnson sat in a meeting about money for the police force. Suddenly, his mom's number lit up his phone. Through the call, he heard angry voices, voices that shouldn't be at his mother's house. He stood up fast, his chair making a loud noise. "Meeting's over," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Something's wrong at my mother's house." Why were these officers really there? What would happen when the police commissioner arrived to find his own mother being harassed? What goes through a mother's mind when she faces fear? How does a woman who raised a powerful son handle being treated like a criminal in her own yard? Patricia Johnson's heart beat fast, but her face stayed calm. 40 years of teaching high school had taught her how to look strong, even when scared. The two police officers moved around her yard like bulls in a china shop, destroying everything in their path. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Officer Matthews spun around. "Don't ask questions. Just stay where you are." The phone in Patricia's pocket was still connected to her son. She spoke a little louder, hoping Marcus could hear every word. "I've lived in this house for 40 years. I'm a retired teacher. All my neighbors know me." "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England," Officer Reed laughed, kicking aside her gardening tools. The sound of breaking pottery made Patricia wince. Her grandson had made that flower pot in art class last spring. "Please be careful. Those are my grandchildren's gifts." "Quiet," Matthews barked. "Reed, check inside the garage. I'll keep an eye on her." Patricia watched as Reed walked to her garage, his heavy boots leaving muddy prints on her clean driveway. How many times had she watched Marcus wash that same driveway as a teenager, complaining about his chores? Now her son ran the entire police department, but these officers were treating his mother like a criminal. "Mrs. Johnson, is everything okay?" called Mrs. Chen from across the street, stepping onto her porch. Before Patricia could answer, Matthews waved his hand at Mrs. Chen. "Go back inside, ma'am. This is police business." More neighbors started appearing on their porches. Mr. Henderson walked closer, holding his phone up. Was he recording? Patricia silently thanked him with her eyes. "Found something," Reed shouted from the garage. Patricia's stomach turned cold. What could they possibly have found? Reed emerged holding a large box. "Look at this, Matthews." Suspicious package. Patricia almost laughed despite her fear. "That's my church donation box. I'm collecting clothes for the homeless shelter." "Yeah? We'll see about that." Matthews ripped open the box, sending carefully folded clothes scattering across the driveway. Patricia's hands trembled with anger now, not fear. Those clothes were meant for people in need. Inside police headquarters, Commissioner Marcus Johnson was already moving. His secretary jumped up as he strode past. Sir, the budget meeting? Call Chief Roberts. Tell him to meet me at 1242 Maple Street, my mother's house. Now. Marcus's voice was cold as ice. Through his phone, still connected to his mother's pocket, he could hear everything. His blood boiled, but his mind stayed sharp. Back in the yard, more neighbors gathered at the edge of Patricia's property. Someone whispered, "Isn't this Commissioner Johnson's mother?" Officer Reed overheard and glanced nervously at Matthews. "Hey, maybe we should—" "Keep searching," Matthews ordered, but sweat now showed on his forehead. Patricia looked at her ruined garden, the scattered clothes, her broken flower pot. She thought about every time she'd told young Marcus to stay calm when faced with prejudice, to fight with his mind, not his fists. Now she took her own advice. "Officer Matthews," she said clearly, knowing her son could hear. "Badge number 6547. Officer Reed, badge number 8891. I want both numbers on record." Matthews stepped closer, trying to look scary. "Are you threatening us?" "No, officer. I'm following procedure. Would you like me to recite the official complaint process as well?" Reed's face went pale. "Matthews, I really think—" A car engine roared in the distance, growing louder. Patricia smiled for the first time since this started. A mother knows things. She knows when her child is coming. "One last chance," she said calmly. "Would you like to explain why you're searching my property without a warrant? Or shall we wait for your superior to arrive?" Matthews laughed, but it sounded shaky. "Superior? Lady, I don't know what you think is happening, but—" The screech of brakes cut him off. A black SUV with police lights stopped at the curb. The neighbor crowd parted like the Red Sea. Officer Reed saw him first. His mouth fell open. "Oh, no!" Matthews turned around. "What's your prob?" The words died in his throat. Commissioner Marcus Johnson stepped out of his SUV. His uniform was perfect, his face like stone. Every metal on his chest caught the dying sunlight. But it was his eyes that made Matthews step back. They burned with a fury that could melt steel. "Mother," Marcus said softly, his eyes never leaving the two officers. "Are you hurt?" Patricia straightened her back. Even now she thought about how to help her son do his job right. "No, Marcus, just my flowers. And the church donation box." Marcus nodded once. He looked at the gathered neighbors, the phone cameras recording everything, the scattered clothes on the driveway. Each detail was a nail in these officers' coffins. "Officers," he said, his quiet voice somehow worse than a shout, "I believe you've just made the biggest mistake of your careers." What would happen to Officers Matthews and Reed? How would a mother's wisdom guide her son's justice? And what changes would this evening bring to their city's police force? Another car pulled up. Chief Roberts had arrived. The real story was just beginning. How quickly can power shift? What happens when those who abuse authority meet someone with real power? The evening air grew thick with tension as Commissioner Marcus Johnson stood between the two officers and his mother. Chief Roberts hurried from his car, his face dark with anger when he saw the mess. "Commissioner, I came as soon as—" Chief Roberts started. Marcus raised his hand, silencing him. "First things first." He turned to his mother, his voice softening. "Mom, please go inside with Mrs. Chen." Patricia touched her son's arm gently. "Marcus, remember what I always taught you about anger." "Yes, Mama. Use it to fix things, not break them." His voice was quiet, but everyone heard. Mrs. Chen came forward, putting an arm around Patricia. As they walked toward the house, Officer Matthews found his voice. "Sir, we were responding to a suspicious person call—" "Silence!" Marcus's shout made both officers jump. "You'll speak when spoken to." Chief Roberts stepped closer. "Officers, your badge numbers." Reed spoke quickly, shaking. 8891, sir." Matthews swallowed hard. 6547, sir." Marcus walked slowly around his mother's yard, noting every crushed flower, every muddy footprint. He picked up a broken piece of pottery, his son's gift to his grandmother. "Tell me, Officer Matthews," Marcus said calmly, too calmly, "do you have children?" Matthews blinked, confused. "Yes, sir. 2 boys." "And do they make things for their grandmother? Special things with their small hands and big hearts?" Matthews looked at the broken pottery in Marcus's hands. His face went pale. "Commissioner, I didn't know," Matthews started. "No, you didn't know," Marcus cut him off. "You didn't know this was my mother's house. You didn't know she's lived here for 40 years. You didn't know she's a retired teacher who collects clothes for the homeless." He stepped closer to Matthews. "But you should have known she's a human being deserving of respect. You should have known that badge means protect and serve, not harass and intimidate." Chief Roberts spoke up. "Both of you, hand over your weapons and badges, now." As the officers removed their badges, a new police car arrived. Internal Affairs investigators stepped out, their faces serious. "Perfect timing," Marcus said. "Chief Roberts, please ensure these officers give their body camera footage to Internal Affairs. Every second must be preserved." Reed's hands shook as he unclipped his camera. Matthews just stood there, frozen. "Something wrong with your camera, Officer Matthews?" Marcus asked softly. Matthews swallowed. I turned it off when we arrived." The crowd of neighbors gasped. Chief Roberts' face turned red with anger. "You what?" he growled. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "That's okay. We have plenty of evidence." He gestured to the neighbors with their phones. "Sometimes the community watches the watchman." He turned to the Internal Affairs officers. "Take their statements, record everything, and call the police union rep. They'll need lawyers." Marcus walked to his mother's front door but stopped. Without turning around, he spoke one last time to Matthews and Reed. "My mother will receive a full apology. Her garden will be restored. The church will get new donations. And you two," he finally turned, his eyes hard, "you two will become an example of what happens when power is abused." Inside her house, Patricia watched through the window. She saw the officers being led away, saw her neighbors sharing their videos with Internal Affairs. Her garden was ruined, but something new was growing in its place. Hope for real change. How would this night change their city's police force? What lessons would Officers Matthews and Reed learn? And how would a mother's wisdom help her son transform tragedy into progress? Chief Roberts stepped beside Marcus. "Sir, the media's already calling. This will be big." Marcus nodded. "Good, it's time everyone saw what really happens on our streets." He looked at his mother's broken flowers. "Time for some weeding in our department." The night was far from over, and the real work was just beginning. What happens when justice meets leadership? How does a son protect his mother while changing an entire system? Inside Mrs. Johnson's living room, the air conditioner hummed softly while chaos swirled outside. Patricia sat in her favorite armchair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that Mrs. Chen had made. Marcus paced the floor, speaking firmly into his phone. "I want every complaint filed against these officers in the last 5 years on my desk by morning," he ordered. Chief Roberts entered with a quick knock. "Sir, the media's here. All the major stations." Marcus looked at his mother. "Mama?" Patricia set down her tea. "Let them see the truth." Outside, news vans lined the quiet street. Camera lights lit up the night like artificial day. The broken pottery pieces and scattered donation clothes still lay on the lawn. "Commissioner," reporters shouted, "can you explain what occurred here?" Marcus stepped onto his mother's porch. 2 hours ago, 2 officers attacked the very values they swore to uphold. They didn't know they were at my mother's house. They didn't know I was listening through her phone. But that's not the point. They shouldn't have done this to anyone. Chief Roberts stepped forward with updates. "Both officers are suspended without pay. Internal Affairs has launched." A commotion at the edge of the crowd cut him off. Officer Reed pushed forward, his face streaked with tears, wearing just his white undershirt. "Mrs. Johnson," Reed called out, "I'm sorry. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I stayed silent out of fear." Patricia appeared in the doorway, standing beside Marcus. "Young man," she said clearly, "fear doesn't excuse wrong actions, but admitting mistakes takes courage." Marcus felt the weight of leadership on his shoulders. "Officer Reed, report to Internal Affairs tomorrow at 9 a.m. Every detail. If you're truly sorry, help us fix what's broken." Church members arrived with boxes of new donations. Neighbors brought flowers and garden tools. The community's response spoke louder than words. Chief Roberts checked his phone. Commissioner, we've got a problem. More reports are coming in. Similar incidents across the city. This wasn't isolated. Marcus straightened his uniform. Get me every complaint, every report. We're not just fixing one incident. Patricia touched her son's arm. Marcus, sometimes a garden needs to be torn up before new things can grow. He looked at his mother, understanding lighting his eyes. This wasn't about one evening or two officers. The rot ran deeper. Chief, Marcus ordered, call an emergency meeting of all precinct captains. Tonight, and get me the police union president. The gathered crowd watched as Commissioner Johnson pulled out his phone and dialed. Mr. Mayor, we need to talk about restructuring the entire department. Now. In the soft glow of the porch light, a mother watched her son step into the biggest fight of his career. Sometimes justice starts in a garden. Can a mother's pain change a city? Will one night of fear lead to years of change? The morning sun hit the broken glass from Mrs. Johnson's flower pot, sparkling like tiny stars on her driveway. News helicopters buzzed overhead as she stepped out in her morning robe, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Look at this mess, she whispered, her heart aching at the sight of her crushed roses. The door opened behind her. Marcus walked out, his uniform neat but his eyes tired. He hadn't slept after the late-night meeting with the mayor and police captains. Morning, Mama. You should be resting. A young girl's voice cut through the morning air. Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson. They turned to see 8-year-old Sarah from down the street running toward them, her mother trying to keep up. In her small hands, she held a potted plant. I saved my birthday money, Sarah said, holding up the flowers, to help fix your garden. Patricia knelt down, tears filling her eyes. Thank you, sweetheart. Sarah's mother stepped forward. Patricia, we had no idea. All those times you told us about being careful with the police. We should have listened better. More neighbors appeared. Mr. Henderson carried garden tools. Mrs. Chen brought fresh cookies. Teenagers from the block showed up with new flower pots. Marcus's phone buzzed. Commissioner, you need to see this. Chief Roberts said on the line. Turn on the news. Patricia led everyone inside. On TV, Officer Reed sat in a studio, still in his civilian clothes. I was wrong, he said, his voice shaking. Not just last night. Many times. We were taught to see threats instead of people. Mrs. Johnson wasn't the first grandmother we harassed. She was just the first who had a son powerful enough to stop us. The news anchor leaned forward. Are you saying this is common practice? I'm saying we need to change everything, and I'll tell every truth I know to help make that happen. Marcus watched his mother's face as she listened. Her hands gripped her coffee cup tighter. Chief, Marcus spoke into his phone, get me Officer Matthews' partner records for the last 10 years. Every complaint, every stop, every arrest. A knock at the door made them jump. 2 elderly black women stood there, tears on their faces. Mrs. Johnson, we saw the news. The same thing happened to us. Last month, same officer. Nobody believed us. Patricia grabbed their hands, pulling them inside. Tell my son everything. The morning turned into a flood. More people came forward. More stories poured out. Matthews hadn't just harassed Patricia. He'd been doing it for years. Marcus set up a desk right there in his mother's living room. He took statements, made calls, built the case. Each story added another brick to the wall that would bring down the corrupt system. Sarah sat on the floor, planting flowers in new pots with other neighborhood kids. Their parents shared coffee and stories in the kitchen. The news cameras caught it all. A community coming together, healing together. Patricia watched from her favorite chair, her heart full of pride and pain. A reporter asked for an interview. Mrs. Johnson, you're a retired teacher. What lesson should we learn from this? She thought of all her years in the classroom, all the young minds she'd shaped. Fear can make good people stay quiet. Love can make quiet people speak up. The reporter pointed at the crowd in her house. Did you expect this response? No, Patricia smiled. But I always told my students that evil wins when good people look away. Today, nobody's looking away. Marcus overheard his mother while reading another complaint file. Her words hit him hard. How many good officers had looked away? How many had stayed quiet out of fear? His phone rang again. The mayor's office. Commissioner, the press is asking about department-wide changes. They want a statement. Marcus looked at the people in his mother's house. Black, white, Asian, young, old, all sharing stories, all demanding change. Tell them to meet me at police headquarters in 1 hour. It's time they saw everything. Patricia touched his arm. What are you planning? You taught me that a good teacher shows the whole truth, Mama. Even the ugly parts. Especially the ugly parts. Chief Roberts burst through the door, his face pale. Sir, Officer Matthews wants to talk. Says he has names. Big names. The room went quiet. Even the children stopped planting flowers. Bring him in, Marcus ordered. Here, Chief Roberts asked, shocked. Right here. Let him face the people he hurt. Let him see their faces. Sarah tugged on Patricia's sleeve. Mrs. Johnson, can we plant these flowers now? My daddy says flowers make sad people happy. Patricia hugged the little girl. Yes, sweetheart, because while the grown-ups fix the big garden of our city, you children can help fix my small garden. Marcus watched his mother with the child, remembering all the times she'd taught him about justice and mercy. Now those lessons would change their whole city. Outside, the media gathered for the upcoming press conference. Inside, people shared pain and hope in equal measure. Officer Matthews would arrive soon, ready to spill his secrets. But right now, watching Sarah plant new flowers in his mother's garden, Marcus understood something deep and true. Change doesn't start with big announcements or secret confessions. It starts in a garden, with broken pottery and crushed roses. It grows through a mother's pain and a child's hope. It blooms when people stop turning away. The door opened again. Officer Matthews had arrived. Officer Matthews stepped into Mrs. Johnson's living room, his face gray and tired. The once proud cop now looked small without his badge and gun. His eyes darted around the room, taking in all the faces watching him. Sit down, Marcus ordered, pointing to a wooden chair in the middle of the room. The fallen officer sank into the chair. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he faced the people he'd wronged. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. Start talking, Chief Roberts growled. Matthews opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Patricia. I've been on the force 20 years. We don't need your resume, Marcus cut in. We need names. A baby cried somewhere in the crowd. Its mother hushed it softly, and Matthews flinched at the sound. What kind of cop gets scared of a baby's cry? You don't understand, Matthews whispered. They'll kill me if I talk. The room went silent. Even Sarah stopped planting her flowers by the window. Who were they? What dark secrets lay buried in the police department? Patricia set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. Young man, I spent 40 years teaching teenagers. I know fear when I see it, but I also know guilt. She stood up, her voice carrying the weight of decades. My son wants names. I want to know why. Why did you choose to become the very thing you swore to fight? Matthew's hands shook. Outside, news vans still lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing at the sky like metal flowers. Inside, a man's soul cracked open. It started 5 years ago, he began. Captain Harris told me to focus on certain neighborhoods, said it was about numbers, about showing results. Marcus leaned forward. Go on. We had quotas, unofficial ones. The more stops we made, the better our records looked. The better our records looked. The faster you got promoted, Chief Roberts finished. Sarah's mother pulled her daughter closer. The little girl's hands were dirty from planting flowers, but her eyes were fixed on Matthews. Even a child could sense the truth coming. Names, Marcus demanded. Every single one. Matthews took a deep breath. Captain Harris, Lieutenant Weber, Sergeant Pierce. The names spilled out like poison from a wound. Patricia watched the man crumble before her. How many lives had been ruined by this corrupt system? How many gardens trampled, spirits broken, futures stolen? Behind her, Sarah had finished planting a small rose bush. Mrs. Johnson, look, even broken things can grow again. The child's words hit harder than any testimony. Matthews put his face in his hands and began to cry. I forgot, he sobbed. I forgot why I became a cop. I forgot about protecting people, about serving. Marcus stood up, his shadow falling over Matthews. You're forgetting hurt people, real people, but now you can help fix it. Chief Roberts was already on his phone. calling internal affairs. The names Matthews gave would shake the department to its core. Outside, the afternoon sun turned the broken glass on the driveway into diamonds. Sarah's new flowers stood brave and tall in the trampled garden. Patricia touched her son's shoulder. "Marcus, remember what I taught you about breaking and building?" He nodded. "You can't build something new until you clear away what's broken." Through the window, they could see more people arriving. Not just neighbors now, but faces from all over the city. Each carried a story, a wound, a hope for change. Matthews looked up, his face wet with tears. "What happens now?" The answer came from an unexpected voice. Little Sarah, her hands still dirty from planting, walked up to the crying officer. "My mommy says when you break something, you have to help fix it. Are you going to help fix things?" In that moment, surrounded by the people he'd hurt and the truth he'd hidden, Matthews made his choice. And somewhere in Mrs. Johnson's garden, new flowers reached for the sun. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson's garden bloomed with new life. Not just her flowers, but with people from across the city planting hope, one seed at a time. Marcus stood at his office window in police headquarters, watching the sunrise. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Turn on the news, son." On every channel, the story played. Officer Matthews' confession had cracked open decades of corruption. Captain Harris was let out in handcuffs. Lieutenant Weber resigned. Sergeant Pierce agreed to testify. But that wasn't the biggest news. Breaking. Police Commissioner Johnson announces new community trust program. Citizens will now oversee police training. But will this change be enough? More stories of police abuse surface daily? Marcus smiled. His mother had taught him well. Sometimes a storm clears the path for something better to grow. "Sir," his secretary called, "Mrs. Johnson is live on social media. You need to see this." On the screen, Patricia stood in her replanted garden, surrounded by children learning to grow flowers. Her voice was strong and clear. "This isn't the end of our story," she said. "It's just the beginning. Every day more truth comes out, more changes happen. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.